Speaker Emerita, do you believe that within the caucus as you currently are constituted, do you believe that the political will is there to ensure that we are measuring and tracking and advancing policies that will redound to legislation that will be able to reinforce the legislative underpinnings of integration as a social policy in this country?
Well, I would defer to others for their view, but I not only believe it, I'm absolutely certain of it. We know why we're here. It's about values and vision about what our country is. And of course, many of us served with John Lewis, who was always there for the more perfect union. And that had to be the path that we were always on. So I don't see any opposition to the fullest embrace of a more perfect union.
Before you move forward, I did want to acknowledge that Ms. Johanna Hayes of Connecticut wanted to respond as well.
Oh, yes. Hello, Representative.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well.
I mean, I don't think anybody's going to be surprised, but you mentioned a lot of things that we should be doing and we can do, like advancing the Voting Rights Act and things like that to protect democracy. But my answer to that question will always be the same answer: to make sure that we are preserving and protecting public education, because ideas like democracy and democratic values are a privileged position for people in communities that are not feeling it. And it has to start with investing in the education of our children, making sure that we have people from those communities who go back to those communities and become professionals who are role models for our kids. One of the things that is really frustrating for me is to hear our colleagues talk about, social workers and teachers and nurses and engineers and the professionals that go into our most marginalized communities as people who have to come from the outside, and not seeing that there's value within that we have to uplift. And unless and until we're doing those things, people are not going to be concerned with turning out to vote. They're not going to be concerned with what is in a legislative package, because as a parent, their one priority is their child. Our priority as the Democratic Caucus and as Americans is protecting the 49 million children that attend public schools. But for that parent, their one shot is their child. So no matter what we do, no matter what bills we put forth, no matter what legislative packages that we are working on, at the center of our work has to be investments in public education and making people believe that they have a shot, and that we are going to do everything that we can to protect that shot. But I don't think that answer is a surprise coming from me to anyone in this room.
Well, we're very familiar with your background in education, happily so. But I would just add to that then, Representative Hayes, the importance of ensuring that the education our children are receiving is also culturally responsive. There have been decades of organizing and outreach efforts between parents and professionals within the field of education who wanted not just to have their children in classrooms, but to ensure that those classrooms were also going to be led by educators who are culturally responsive. And when we have an understanding on this show that every school community is culturally responsive, the question is to whose culture are they responding? So I so appreciate you reminding us about the need for importance in education, particularly as we are dealing with a Department of Education being dismantled and or led by someone who is utterly unqualified for that position. We have a phrase here. I know people like to say it's a DEI hire, but we recognize diversity math here. And that means that phrase within my community, which says we have to be twice as good to get half as far. By the time we get to the ending, we're 4 times better than much of our competition. And we have these folks who are in power now who are not DEI candidates, but we have been calling instead for a new term, WEI, which means that if the only qualifications are that you're a white, entitled, and incompetent, you seem to have a place in this administration. That was political. I don't know if y'all can go there, but that's just me. But I want to move, as we've been able to speak a bit about education, we are also moving towards, I would like to move towards a question that looks at militarization and what's happening with policing. We are now in Project 2025 America. And one of my great concerns about this moment was what was going to happen to expand policing powers. And that coupled with the cancellation and the eradication of social services. So I want to paint an image for you, and I would like for you to respond, whomever is ready to respond. We're about 4 months away from the end of the school year here in New York City. And the programs that many of our children rely upon come through many of the agencies that are now being targeted by Doggy. I know it's called Doge, but we like Doggy for reasons that I will spare you all from hearing. But this entity is essentially defunding most of the institutions that many of our communities rely upon. So we're about 4 months out from the summer when kids in my city of New York are going to need free lunch programs, free breakfast programs. They're going to need summer activities and programs to keep them engaged and making good choices. We're going to have a whole class of seniors all across the country who are going to be attempting to go to college with doubts. And as a parent of a now 18-year-old, these are doubts that we now have about the viability of the Department of Education to continue to serve as that centering pillar, which helps to ensure that all of us have as much access to an equitable education as we possibly can. So 4 months from now, all of the American children are going to be unleashed onto the summer streets, largely in communities where most of the social services, if the current administration has its way, are going to have been defunded. At the same time that police across the nation are going to be unfettered and cloaked in a presidential granting of not qualified immunity, but full immunity. When it comes to these sorts of physical threats that are showing up in our communities already. And for those of us who live in communities like Brooklyn, New York, we've already seen what that looks like, but we are now seeing that expand in some ways. Are we at the point, or is your party at the point where you understand the risks of expanding militarized policing and racial surveillance? And I would add that this is also happening at the same time that the people who seem to be funding all of this dismantling and who seem to be backing this are also at the heads and sitting at the heads of institutions and organizations that are mass surveillance organizations as well. So the mass surveillance of someone like an Elon Musk, the unlimited capacity for immunity, which will cloak police officers and millions of American children on these community streets, has a mother like me, an activist like me, extraordinarily worried. What is it that your party is preparing to do both now and should you assume power to ensure that the intensity of the militarization of our police force, there are some concerns that the military might at some point be involved in this. We saw the dismissal of the judge advocate generals, the removal of highly qualified generals being replaced with lesser qualified subordinates who have declared their love for the leader of the current administration. What is the Democratic Party prepared to do to address this militarization and the potential threats that this poses to our communities, particularly our young people?
Well, that's a whole lot there. That's a whole lot there. But, there's no doubt that we see the writing on the wall as a Congressional Black Caucus. And we are very focused on legislation that we have introduced, throughout the decades. But around that is also the education. And I think that Johanna Hayes really put that in context for us. Our communities need to be anchored and rooted in not only the historical context of where we are and where our people have been before, but how they were able to overcome that. And we are definitely in the battle beyond an existential threat to Black communities. So the legislation that we introduce has to be disseminated across the United States of America in every community so that folks are empowered with the knowledge of knowing that with the right constellations in the Congress, we can get legislation. We can have laws in this nation that protect the interests of the American people, but it requires their participation. It requires their faith and understanding their power in a democratic society. And I think that that's work that's worth doing. I mean, people have lamented here because there are a lot of boomers in the Congress, that there's no more civics in school. And, to the extent that there have been gaps in the education of Americans, it has accrued to the benefit of those who push propaganda and conspiracy theories. This is fundamental 101. We've got to get out of Washington, D.C. We've got to be on the ground. We don't have the votes right now to necessarily advance legislation. We have our unity that can stop some of the worst things from happening, but we also need to make sure that our folks are educated and prepared with the knowledge of all of the legislation that transforms our civil society, that centers a multicultural society, a Black society in the context of the United States of America, and we're prepared to do that. I want to open the floor to other colleagues who go on and jump on in. Catherine Clark Cousin Clark of Massachusetts.
Thanks so much. I think one of the ways that we are looking at this is opening up portals that keep track of all the legislation we are filing in response to what we are seeing. And that certainly includes attacks on diversity, on civil rights, on reforms that we've made in policing, and a whole host of topics that impact our Black communities. And so we have to keep that accountability that the Speaker Emerita talked about. We have to keep track of that. And we have to have a public place where people can see the work, the bills that we would bring to the floor when we're returned to the majority. But right now, I have to say the tool that we are using most effectively in the minority is the courts and the rule of law, because that is where we can do the immediate stop to the damage that we're seeing. So not only have we set up an in-house clearinghouse of litigation so that members know where we are working very closely with our Democratic AGs. We consistently invite Republican AGs when they are affected by things like cuts to cancer research that impacts their public universities as well. But our Democratic AGs, Democracy Forward, other groups that are bringing these cases to court is a critical piece. And as these cases progress and the opportunities for us to file briefs that support these positions and bring the pieces and the impacts on civil rights to the courts. The bad news is we have had to file over 80 cases already in response to executive orders. The good news is we are winning in the courts. There are a few cases that have been we have not been successful over standing issues, but on the merits, on the substance, we are winning. So that is a powerful tool that we have to use to make sure that until we have the authority again and the majority to put these bills on the floor and vote on them and bring them into law, that we are showing the public what we would do when we have power again, and that we are enforcing our current rights and protections and civil rights in the courts.
I'm so glad to hear you reference the courts. One of the challenges of not having civics in education is that we often, as the public, can make demands or have expectations of various members of our democracy that are outside and exceed the authority that they actually have to act. And so when it comes to the capacity that you have in the minority, we recognize that there are some limitations there. And thank God for the courts, and thank God for the Judiciary Committee that was able to confirm sufficient numbers of judges so that we have a full panoply of justices that have committed to upholding the rule of law. But that actually allows for a great segue into one of the questions that we have here from the audience, referencing something that I believe Speaker Jeffries said earlier. If there are 3 votes that are needed and you all are using what legislative tools that you can, there is a palpable sense of frustration within the American population as a result of not feeling as though enough is happening and enough is happening quickly. There is a question in the chat that says, if there are 3 votes that are needed, how would you suggest that we, the people, organize and communicate with our fellow community organizers who live in the states where there are the vulnerable? Which are there particular legislators that you think should be focused on? I didn't get a chance to share this with my show this morning. I'll have to do it tomorrow. There's a list of, at least that I've seen, of 29 Republicans who are in purple districts or in districts where a significant portion of their population is reliant upon social services that might get cut in the next budget proposals that are coming down. What would you suggest that the people do? If you all are exercising what tools are at your disposal, in the minority, yes, but exercising what tools that you have, what should the people be doing? And I will just hearken back to the image of, which was, I thought, a very wonderful moment when so many of you went to and were confronted by, I'm assuming, a private security person, and there was, a lot of back and forth. And while I was excited about that,
Department of Education.
Yes, thank you so much, Department of Education. While we were excited about that, I saw a number of folks comment commenting at town halls recently that had that been John Lewis, rest his soul, that he would have gotten arrested that day. He would have moved around the folks who were there. And when I've said that to people, the response is, well, yeah, that might be true. And I know there's a limit to what the Democrats can do, but we just saw people scale the walls to get into the Capitol. Not saying we need y'all to scale walls, but there is a real concern that the legislative powers that you all have may not be ripe for this moment. If that is the case, how should the people be organizing to better empower you and to empower ourselves to do what's going to be necessary to, again, save the democracy and allow for an expansion of the multiracial nature thereof?
We're going to have the chairman of our Democratic Caucus, Pete Aguilar, take this question.
All right.
Thank you, Chair Clark. Thank you, Lurie, for the question. As Whip Clark mentioned, the courts is one avenue that we can use. You're hitting on another avenue. So the Congress, the courts, and the third pillar of our ability to respond that I would tell you and your listeners is the community. It's each and every one of us and your listeners have the opportunity to have your voices heard. Just because you're in a blue state or you might be in a blue district doesn't mean your reach and your voice can't be heard in some of those other districts that you mentioned, more purple districts where individuals who are not friendly reside. And so we have an opportunity to make our voices heard, and we should use every lever possible in order to do that. You saw over the last 10 days, we have had district work periods, and you have seen time and time again, some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, every time they faced their voters and they had their voices heard, there was pushback. There was real concern in the eyes of so many of our constituents at the potential attacks on Medicaid and healthcare, our communities, our kids, as you mentioned, and the policies that could be enacted. So our ability to make our voices heard is truly one of the most important things that we can do. And so taking action and making sure that we're being peaceful demonstrators, but that we are making our voices heard is so incredibly helpful, and it's noticed here in the Capitol. And so that's what we have all tried to do when we are doing events in the public. It is so our community members can all see and understand exactly what we're doing. And that's something that a place where people can take action without a doubt. And I know Vice Chair Liu also wanted to make a comment.
Thank you, Chairman Aguilar. To your question about which Republicans, I just want to say all Republican legislators, because we don't know where those 3 votes might come from. So I'll give you an example. Tom Massey from Kentucky is not in a swing district, but he's very likely going to be a no on this radical Republican budget scheme. That's a betrayal of American values. So I think just important to go to every Republican legislator and show up at their town halls and let them know what the people think. And then think about social media, right? It's free. You write an interesting post. Maybe someone in Florida reads it, or in Ohio, or in Oregon. Think about writing letters to the editor. It's true, they do get lots of letters to the editor. It's also true they often come from the same people. So when other folks start writing in, you'll get published and you'll start changing hearts and minds. And think about supporting those organizations that fight in the courts, whether it's the NAACP or the ACLU. There are a lot of organizations that do need help right now.
There's
Bobby,
some
did you want to respond?
I was going to emphasize the fact that we should be supporting the organizations that are doing the litigation: ACLU, NAACP, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Democracy Forward, CREW, Citizens for Responsible Ethics in Washington. There are a lot of different groups filing these lawsuits. About 100 so far. Usually a big lawsuit is about all one organization can handle before they go broke. They've filed 100, so they need a lot of support. And as far as finding these Republicans, a lot of them are prancing around like they're thoughtful moderates and voting right down the line for cuts in Medicaid, cuts in everything else, cuts in education funding, cuts in funding for summer programs that you mentioned that are so important to keep kids occupied. They're going to do something in the summer. They can be organized activities, or they can be, other kinds of activities that get them in trouble. But we need to make sure that all of the children have something constructive to do with their time during the summer. And those are the exact same programs that are being cut. but everybody can do something, and supporting the organizations that are filing suit, I think, is one of the most constructive things that can happen. But everybody's hassling the Democrats. We don't expect to lose a single vote on this budget in a few minutes. Republicans, if we can find 3, they can't pass their budget.
Okay. Well, we
just need 3.
We're gonna pray for all of them.
We just need 3.
We just need 3. In the chat, there's a real appreciation for all of them. So, and then I meant all of them, just like how I said it, because we speak multi languages here.
We have Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida.
Excellent.
Thank you. I don't have a question, but I did want to sort of piggyback on the DEI question that we were just talking about. Another example of ways to push back. It's quite clear to me that there are Republican members of Congress that really have no idea in any intricate way how this blanket shutdown of DEI programs is impacting so many people. For example, the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, that's also being shut down, halted from being able to start any other investigations. This is an office that is both deals with discriminatory actions taken on college campuses when it comes to racism, but also anti-Semitism, which has obviously seen a precipitous rise since October 7th of 2023. And they have halted additional investigations from being started, halted the investigations that are going on now, and essentially are shutting down that office. And I mean, there are Republican members. I just came from the Anti-Semitism Task Force meeting. There were Republican members, some of whom are in the leadership of that group, who had no idea that was happening. And so we have to make sure that we are not just assuming that our friends on the other side of the aisle are just going to walk in lockstep and do whatever it is that Trump says. We have to be a little bit more granular and bring some of these decisions to their attention to help make sure that we can turn back the tide, especially in conjunction with having their constituents put tremendous pressure on them.